Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, a registered social worker and therapist in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of experience as a social worker and 5 years working as a therapist. And in my practice, I focus particularly on those who have been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, as well as scapegoating within a dysfunctional family. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some common patterns that exist for the scapegoat once they've went no contact. I was wanting to talk briefly about the notion of the theory of change model. And so typically that's used within an addiction context. So if someone's first usually in denial with their addiction, then they might be in pre-contemplative, some sense they have a problem but aren't thinking it's much to do with their problem or they're minimizing it. And then there's those who are in contemplation, understand there's a problem but fear taking action. And then those actually taking action, once they're taking action, they're really stopping the addiction. And then there's just maintenance phase. So you're just maintaining so that you don't go back into addiction. But as many addicts, I think, know, once they maybe have a drink or the addiction comes out again, they fall back to square one, where it could be the sense that they were in denial or they let the addiction became overpowering to them. But this is just a notion that they start back at square one, and it's a sense that they're in some degree maybe denial, but then perhaps not wanting to take action. When you're in a narcissistic abuse cycle, and that's your family of origin, and that's what you know to be normal growing up, and yet you're experiencing this mistreatment, and possibly at first you consider that it's likely maybe to do with you, or perhaps you do see it in others and you think that your family members are mistreating you, but because it's your family, it's too hard or painful to accept they betray you or that there's no sense of love in these homes. You could be in denial. Time and space has an interesting way to operate, because maybe you originally do know what happened, but then you get busy and your life gets going, and maybe your mood changes, and perhaps you consider maybe they're not as bad as I thought, or maybe I'm overthinking things, or so you have a tendency to minimize or even gaslight yourself. Society and families operate. We all want our family to rely on and to be a safe space for us and somewhere we can feel supported. When we come from a scapegoat home and we're the scapegoat and it's a narcissistic family, then the case is that we're in this narcissistic abuse cycle, in the sense that it's really just us serving the narcissist. It could be both parents or one parent, and then the siblings are also aligning with the narcissist. And you could consider that if in the early stages of your family of origin, and this is just also to do with your child, so I think a child is too much and too painful, right? So it makes sense that you would suppress, and the child would not want to fully, or is not even really able to fully face this. As you become an adult, you learn how people are and how mistreatment is wrong. So you come to understand, and that's usually the pre-contemplative stage. Perhaps we came across videos or literature online where things started to make sense, particularly with the lens of narcissism. And it's tricky because, when I had an interview with Sam Vatkin, he talks about the notion of explanatory heuristic. When we apply the lens of narcissism to, let's say, we had a breakup and we consider that the person we were with was a narcissist, then a lot of their behavior and their actions start to make sense. And so in some sense, we're all in humans to some degree self-seeking. And so I guess we all have a level of narcissism. But if you've truly made the discernment that it's not just a way to explain it, that there actually is observable facts, then you embrace the truth and you come to know the truth. And that's applying a level of skepticism, because I think we should always be considerate of how we might be off or maybe not fully accurate. But that is a very tricky line, because you can also lead into too much self-doubt and gaslight yourself in the sense that you deny the truth. This comes back to the theory of change model. You can apply it to any area of life in terms of humans and why we don't want to change. Even if we say we want to change, there's usually the notion, at least within Freud, the notion of the defenses. So we have these other parts of ourselves that come up and defend us or sabotage us or give us kind of justification of why we shouldn't change. It's interesting to know that we're not just one person, And it's just really figuring out who is the leading, like who's driving the bus. But if we've come to know the truth and we're honoring the truth, there is this notion of once we see something, we can't deny it. Once you've glimpsed the truth, push it away, but you've seen it, truth doesn't argue back. You could consider that you've been in denial for most of your childhood, not because of necessarily anything you did or that you were wrong, but because you were projected on by the authorities, and the hierarchy basically said that you are this way. And when you have the whole family aligning with that, and you also don't want to rock the boat and you don't want there to be this conflict and this disharmony. But then by speaking the truth and just being yourself, you find yourself continually in this pattern where the family attacks you, or there's just this big emotional situation, drama. But that is to consider that we're still in the cycle in that regard, because we're more likely in denial and or pre-contemplative stage at that point. But once we've done some research online, and it's likely the case that we started to read up on narcissism and narcissistic family dynamics and scapegoating and these different roles, then we're very much in the action stage usually. That's still part of the journey, because you went limited or no contact for a year or longer, and yet you've come back to the family, and perhaps there's a notion of false hope. And often I do get calls just from clients, and I don't tend to work with these clients as much, but you could consider them more codependent in the sense that they're still in a relationship with the narcissist. They're usually asking, can you talk to my husband or wife? Typically it's the woman motivating therapy, so it's usually a husband they want me to talk to. But it's either, there's a sense that obviously narcissists, if they have narcissistic style or they're more narcissistic types, so they have just more qualities narcissism, but they at least have some level of self-reflection maybe, then it's the case that perhaps some of their behavior can change. And if a narcissist is truly self-reflective, then of course there could be insight and hopefully change. But the personality is built on the false self. I've spoken in other videos about that. Sam Vakin talks about working and talking with a narcissist. There's the words and the motivation behind the words. And so that's just the situations that usually those types are not wanting to take any ownership or see their fault, so they externalize. But I mention all this is because these, I think, codependent people believe on false hope. And maybe they have their reasons, right? They want to keep together because of their kids, or maybe there have been some good times, and maybe there's also this notion that codependence there can be a level of narcissism. That's an interesting topic. Because they've been with narcissists so long, they have their own codependent narcissism. When you spend a lot of time, your entire existence, or at least 20, 30 years with somebody, and they're narcissistic, it is likely the case that because you're in a defense posture, because for narcissism is an aggressive disorder, then you're in that sense defending. And in that defense, probably develop narcissistic characteristics as well in that defense. Yeah, just there's an interesting understanding of how living and being with a narcissist, or being in a family dynamic where you're exposed to a narcissist, then you can develop characteristics that are similar. And not to say that you are the narcissist, but just that the narcissist wants to convince you that's the way to be and that's the way life is. And I think we all do this to some degree, but we all want to, or we think the universe is like us in some sense. But I think maturity, we understand that people are different, and then there's a host of different kinds of people. And there's, of course, human nature, but obviously narcissism is a disorder. And it's not something where we should emulate, especially if we're healthy, relatively healthy people. If you've done your reading and research and you're no longer in denial, but perhaps I've had clients, again, where they've reached out to me, and I would say that they're in pre-contemplation because they have false hope or future faking. So the narcissist might tell them that they are going to change and that they're going to seek therapy and this kind of thing. But then if you understand the narcissistic abuse cycle, you understand it's the hoovering and love bombing phase. You can also understand this in a family dynamic. Let's say you had a conversation with your father and really explained that what you said and did was uncalled for, and you seeking apology maybe, or You want them to take some accountability of their actions, and perhaps you went no contact, and I guess they understand that you're actually serious. And so perhaps they'll suggest that maybe they'll consider going to therapy. You believe them because you want there to be a healthy family. But I imagine you've probably been through this cycle many times. And so you also know that I guess you're being played maybe in some sense. And yet it's interesting because then I'll have clients, again, I understand perhaps why they're doing this, but they're looking for, there's some solution or some like cure for narcissism. Or they also want some validation, usually because they've gaslight themselves, and because they've been around the narcissist for so long, or around like the flying monkeys or the golden child, they want confirmation from a professional that what they're dealing with is true. But that's the thing also, is that you can't, in some sense, even a professional has an hour with you, right? Usually a week. And obviously it can speak into and probably pick up on a lot of patterns and common psychological and emotional understandings. But at the same time, it's like your reality, it's your life. You ultimately have to come to know the truth for yourself and be willing to have the courage to act on that truth. And that's honoring, I would say, what is real and what is true and good in the world. If you're living in a false consciousness or bad faith, you know the truth, but you're still living in accordance to not living in that truth. And humans are complex, and so there's notion of cognitive dissonance, and there's survival instincts and patterns from families and evolutionary origins, ways we rely on parents to provide. But as adults, we understand we don't need physically like our family necessarily, but yet we would hope that we can continue that relationship. However, because we've determined that they're narcissistic, we have to accept that you can't really fix what is broken unless you see them change and make amends. But because of their foundation and like who they are as a person, they really don't change. And you can't spend your life waiting for someone to change. You have to live on your own terms. Be in the action level of change, and you're just maintaining. You could consider it almost like an addiction. Let's say you go home and you want to give it one last try. I'll have clients reaching out for therapy for themselves or for their husband, and often they're confused. Should I get the therapy, or should my husband get the therapy, or should we get it as a couple? And so, one, they don't know what they want because they're in this kind of confusion. But two, they often will say to me, this is my last attempt to really try. Because if it doesn't work now, and it could be the case that their kids are already in their 20s, and so that can be used as a reason. I'll leave once the kids are old enough. You maybe have a mortgage together, but according to someone like Sam Vac, there's no good reason to stay. The more work I've done in this area and working with clients, I've come to terms with that's likely the case. It has to be on your terms where you've made that assessment, but there is actual NPD. If you have been the scapegoat, or you continuously receive abuse and gaslighting and distortion from somebody that that's supposed to love you, then certainly that is not a healthy relationship. And it's a toxic relationship, and it's really just going to cause issues with your nervous system, longevity in your life, just your overall happiness and well-being. And really, it's just not, I think, the purpose for us to be on this planet is to be someone's punching bag or to be in this negative loop or cycle. I believe, and I think that the universe or God or whatever you want to say, perhaps this is just a lesson where you've had to grow strong for whatever reason. You were on the planet and born into this situation. Could be a family of origin that's toxic. But once you know the truth, you have to honor that, and you have to, usually can be a very lonely journey, especially the first couple of years, because there's also your identity, because your whole identity is based off of your family of origin, right? Or largely it is. Who are you when you leave? Usually it's later in life, 30s, 40s, or 50s. It's like you're in the twilight zone. Your life was real and you had experiences, but the conclusions you drew weren't accurate. Your constant rumination, beating yourself up, being the bully to yourself, is very much seen as understanding of the family of system that was orientating you to that kind of thinking. But yeah, it's dealing with loneliness, living in defiance of the narcissist. It's determining your identity on your own terms and figuring out who you are, independent from the scapegoating role, the blame, the shame, the guilt. Also getting supportive friends and people that know you for who you are. For the narcissist, everything's inauthentic, built on a false self and a lie. For the scapegoat, they reflect the truth. No one's perfect, we're all developing, but at least the scapegoat has, I would say, more accurate basement in truth, whereas the family's in denial. And you can, as a scapegoat, stay in denial or start to accept the truth and live in defiance of the system, and finding people in your life that are authentic, that know you for who you are. This isn't easy because this exists so long in your life for many decades, that people in your life, you'll continue to attract this dynamic. People having strong reactions to you because let's say that you are a truth teller or you're someone who is authentic, and when you're around people that aren't authentic, they might try to borrow in some sense that energy from you or look for your empathy, but you find yourself in these patterns where people who you thought you knew weren't really who you thought they were, which again mirrors your child family of origin issues. And so this could be in a romantic situation or within friendships or even work environments. The more you heal and you start to really reflect on the limited beliefs of the scapegoat, in other videos I've talked about different aspects of this. I wouldn't say that even the psychological analyzing is well and good, but it comes at a very core level of who you are. It comes back to this abandonment, that you don't have a family. There's the archetype of the abandoned child or the orphan child. And perhaps you spent as a scapegoat your whole life like not wanting to be an orphan. It's interesting because in Plato or Socrates, there's the notion that truth is just learning, we've always known it in some sense, it's always there. So knowledge is just remembering. You knew these things because you were more mature or you had more awareness than your family from a young age. The family saw this as a threat. Maybe you watered yourself down or numbed yourself in order to not be such a difficult person as the way that the family tried to make you out to be. But that's to know that you were actually shining and you were representing truth, and that's very much to be in your power and a more powerful person. If you have a strong intellect skills and you're a good person, that's incredibly powerful. And I think that the narcissist and the narcissistic family understand that to some level, and they try to subjugate you to the family system and to scapegoat you and smear your name. You have to accept the family narrative and projection, to own your shadow. It's not really your shadow, it's their shadow. It's almost like in a movie, right? There's a saying, you live long enough to become the villain. In a movie, there's a black hat and a white hat, old school movies, right? You have to be willing to put on the black hat, just in the sense that, okay, if they're going to smear my name, then as long as you're like saying yes or allow them to say what they want, because you know it not to be true, and it's not even worth arguing against. The jade techniques don't justify, explain, argue, or defend. You're feeding the cycle, and if you're being betrayed, then there is, you're probably going to have to struggle with some level of seeking accountability and atonement or responsibility from them. As humans, we have impulses where perhaps we want revenge. We want some level because they're smearing your name and they're the ones that took your childhood from you. I think it's understanding that, like, who you're dealing with, that you're dealing with a disordered, sick individual who doesn't want to seek help or doesn't think there's a problem with them. And so you having any form of communication within that cycle or within that personality is just really not useful or productive. And so once you accept it, you go low or no contact. And it's also just dealing with the identity around having that black hat. It's almost like you can just accept, okay, if they think I'm this like evil or hurtful or abusive person, which is actually interesting because it's actually the family themselves not owning their shadow. They project onto you and play the victim. And there's the notion within narcissistic abuse, the reversal of the aggressor and the victim. Usually there's some pawn, like a third. This could be the golden child or just some flying monkey or some enabler that's in the family. Could be the codependent that gets roped in to convince the scapegoat they're at fault. Why are you being difficult? Your mom or dad's not that bad. Why can't we just get along? So there's a sense of forced harmony. And because that plays on our instincts to want to reconcile and have harmony, but harmony has to be built on truth, right? It has to be built on what is real. Committing to truth and authenticity is the only way to really live, because you can't build a foundation such as a family on a faulty foundation, as in a faulty personality that's dysfunctional. In this video, I've talked about aspects of going low to no contact, the theory of change models. Growing up, you were likely more in denial, not because of intention, but because of development and survival patterns. But yet, when we've come across knowledge, we remember and we understand and we see these patterns from our life. Through that knowledge, we usually are in contemplation, but perhaps we don't have the courage or the willingness this time to take action. But once we do take action, we've decided, we move forward. It's more than maintaining and not going back to the well. And some people, like my clients, I had this one client who, as a practice, he wrote down all the reasons, like all the things that happened through his life that were negative or that were abusive or emotionally neglectful. And that was just a good reminder to have some inventory of what happened in their life, to just remember why we left, why we're going no contact, and why it's not our fault. That should be in the maintenance phase. Sometimes we get back into the cycle, react, feel like we should have known better, but then it's just picking ourselves up, getting back to truth, honoring our authenticity, and maintaining it. In this video, I've talked about accepting the black hat and a more negative identity, and just getting a chosen family or friends and people that are supportive of you and honor that authenticity in you, and also just living in defiance of the narcissist and the narcissistic family. Thanks and have a great day.